First, I want to truly thank Ed and Bev and Ben for being here. When we did this back in March and April, I was all by myself, completely empty church. And you guys had to listen to me do prayer and scripture and offering and all of that. And for just not being lonely is well worth it, but being able to participate too. I think that if we could make it as close to church as possible, maybe it would still be a blessing for everybody, and we can hang on to them, And so, I welcome you to join us. Just a handful of us here, but they made sure that we could all worship today. So, I had a new series to start. I was looking at my calendar from last year, and I realized that on this Sabbath a year ago, I started a series in Daniel. And we got as far as Daniel 7. As a matter of fact, Daniel 7 was going to be the next sermon when they closed us. And of course, Daniel is a very special book to us. And what I wonder is, had we continued with the book of Daniel, what would it have done for us as we continued? I have a tendency, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I have a tendency that when I'm preaching and events begin to happen, I rarely change. I could remember my sermon on 9/11 was the very next sermon in the series. And because I thought that the best way that we could serve each other was to just, spend it, I forget where we were at, but we were in a gospel, and I thought to be able to change the service rather than change the sermon. I regret that, though, because 9/11 is that one event, at least in my lifetime, and in my short lifetime as a Seventh-day Adventist, that I began asking the question what I had heard many, many Seventh-day Adventists asking, and that is, how much more is there? Certainly, 9/11 was an event that made Adventists say that it can't get any worse than this. Well, this year will be the 20th anniversary. And as if on cue, 2020 says to 9/11, that was nothing. And of course, it continued, and especially for the events of this week. So it made me rethink. And at least for this week, I at least wanted to talk just a little bit about what we may be facing, especially over the next few months. And to ask this question, what more is there? What is this going to look like? And like I said, the events of this week were really what got me to rethink this. I've got a sermon calendar planned, and we'll start a new series. And I'm really looking forward to it, because we're going to preach through the Gospel of John, as we've been doing in prayer meeting. Maybe I had to promise prayer meeting people maybe not as slow, okay, or as involved, but we'll start that pretty soon. But for this week, I want us to think about this. I want us to think about end time and what we're looking at and what may be. So in Matthew 24, in Jesus' discourse about the end time, what it would mean to live in the end time, he gave a set of signs of what they would be. And in all of these signs Jesus gave, there was a particular sign that seemed to be specific, one that wasn't time sensitive. In fact, it relied on the people. It relied on the disciples. And he said, because of the increase of the lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So yes, the gospel will be proclaimed throughout, but how sure is that sign of the gospel being proclaimed throughout? How will we know when the gospel has been proclaimed to all the world? Because that includes everybody living at the time. I'm not sure that there's going to be any one person on earth who's going to be able to say, okay, that's done, right? The only way that you'll be able to know that that's done is Jesus comes next. So when he does come, we can say, hey, that last sign came up. It's the other one. The other one. The love of many will what? Will grow cold. The love of many will grow cold. See, the gospel is everlasting, and it'll be preached. But what's the framework? How will it be preached? Well, think about it. If the love of the world is growing cold, then the only thing that we have to fight that with is the gospel. And the gospel has to be preached, unquote, quote unquote, in a framework. And that framework will be against the apathy that we see the world, and unfortunately, much of the church fall into. Apathy is a good way to describe Laodicea, don't you think? I am rich and I have need of nothing. I don't care what's going on out there. So amidst a growing apathy, the inability to love, and the end time is our creation finally caving in to that inability to love. It's been going on for thousands of years. Humans have been unable or have an inability to love by nature, if you will. So it's been destroying our creation, wouldn't you agree? The end time is the very last gasp that creation has before it completely collapses to apathy, to a substitute, if you will, for love. When we study the 7 churches in Revelation, when you look at them, we learn that they can be studied or viewed in 2 ways. One is that they were real churches. They faced real issues of their day. Those were real churches that John was writing to. They all existed at that particular time. And what you can do is you could look at them as real churches, and you could take them and you could apply them to our day. But prophetically, the other way to see them is as a history of the Christian church. It begins when Jesus leaves these incarnated disciples to go unto all the world, and it goes all the way till when? To today, the very last church. Laodicea, we know, is of today. So the 7 churches is the complete history of the church from Ephesus to Laodicea. The 2,000 years that is surpassed since 33 AD. So you can argue and debate all you want about what that means and what it means to make disciples and the methods to do so. But there is one thing that Jesus absolutely says, this has to happen. This has to happen in order for you to be a disciple, and in order for us to fulfill what we're supposed to fulfill. And that is to go and make disciples of all the world. And he said, I give you a new commandment that you what? That you love. Okay? That you love. And where do we begin? Each other. That's right. Each other, the people in our circle. Family, neighborhood, church. And back then, church was your neighborhood. You really didn't have the opportunity to roam too far outside your neighborhood. It was only as far as you could walk. So church was them. I want you to love one another. How much? At least as much as I have loved you. So that you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples. Okay? Is how you love, if you have love for one another. And when you look at the first church in the 7 churches of Revelation, the very first church, the first church that begins to try to fulfill this mission after the apostles have all died, the first church of the post-apostolic era, if you will, he says to the angel of the church in Ephesus, these are the words to him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. When Jesus says, this is now my church, and from here throughout history, I will be walking among them. This is me, it's my church. He's got 7 stars representing the lights that the 7 churches have. He's walking amongst the gold lampstands. The church is supposed to be the light of the world from Ephesus to Laodicea. From somewhere around 40 AD to 2021 now. And he says to him, you're doing some good stuff. I know your works. Your toil, your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You've tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you're enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. You're doing some good stuff, he says. But the very command, the very thing that he told the church from the beginning that they were going to need to do in order to make disciples of the world, the very first church in the post-apostolic era, he says, I have this against you. You've abandoned what? You've abandoned your love. It didn't take long, did it? See, he came to establish a new kingdom, to counteract the kingdom of the world. There's a lot of things we can say about the kingdom of the world, but I can say this. Love is not one of its founding principles. Love is not a fundamental principle of the kingdom of the world. It certainly is not how the kingdom of the world is governed. Okay? So he says, so what they do is they co-opt the mission. The church begins to look for a way to do it without what? Okay? Let's do it without love. So I'm not sure, I can't tell you how they were doing or what was going on, but imagine purifying the church of all heresy, but doing it without love. Actually, I don't have to imagine it, because I've been in churches that do that. Jesus' love for them. They forget that they are loved. They forget that they are to love with his love. And by the way, we can't love each other without the first love. My argument is the first love isn't Ephesus love for him. It's not that it's a new romantic, passionate love and it's fizzled out. The first love is that Jesus loved us. I can't begin to understand of what it means to love each other if I do not realize that he loves me. They've abandoned love. They've abandoned love. So Jesus' love for them, and if you forget the first love, you can't accomplish. You can't accomplish love for each other, let alone everyone else. Now I want you to go love the whole world. Now that you love each other, go love the world. You can't do that. And the problem is, it's all downhill from here. If you look at the seven churches, they deteriorate in value. They deteriorate in praise. All the churches get some sort of praise. All the churches get some sort of rebuke. Okay? There are only two churches that get absolute praise and no rebuke. And there's only one that gets no praise. And it's the last one. It's the very last one. It's the last church that says that they are a church of Christ. But they took Jesus and they locked him out. To the church of Laodicea, behold, I stand at the door and knock. So he's saying to Laodicea, if you try to do it without love, you're trying to do it without me. So it's all downhill from here. That's a great thing about prophecy. Is a prophecy, we never really know what it is until after it's already been fulfilled. And he said, I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may what? You may believe that I am he. He told us in Revelation what's about to occur. For us, the seven churches is 99.9% history. Prophecy fulfilled. So we can look on it and we could see that it's been fulfilled. And when we do, we can come to a place of what? Of belief, of faith. That's how we gain faith. So 99% of prophecy for us is history. Prophecy has a unique way of describing this particular history with the church, though. And this happens to be the history of the church. What do we know about the church in the end? What do we know about our situation today in the end? In the end, there are only two churches. Okay, there are only two. The church of the Lamb that was slain and the church of the who? The church of the beast. Okay. See, sometimes we try to get across to people that it's the church against the world. You know, be of the world. Be in the world, not of it. You know, that the church is battling the world. No, it's two churches. Two churches trying the same mission, but trying it with two different frameworks. Church of the beast and the church of the Lamb that was slain. The fundamental difference between the church of the beast and the church of the Lamb that was slain is love. It's the fundamental difference. And he said, the church of the beast, we're told in prophecy that it's going to have a period of extended great success. He said it was allowed to make war on the saints being the ones that are hanging on and trying to be in that church of the Lamb that was slain. Conquer them. It was given to the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. He was given unsurmountable access. It says all the inhabitants of the earth will what? Everybody will worship the beast. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. Everybody, except for that group of people who still think that they can hang on, who still think that they can love the world to Jesus. Everyone else worships who? Worships the beast. And the language changes with the all of a sudden, everyone is, all of a sudden you have words like slain and slaughtered. Okay, what used to be applied to Christ in the church of the Lamb that was slain now is slaughter amongst people, and it's the church that's doing the slaughtering. It's allowed to make war. So the whole language changes with the beast. Words like war and slaughtering people, rather than being slaughtered as Jesus was as our sacrifice. And it's a power like never been seen before, one that is entirely focused on the taking away of freedom. They are forced to worship. By the way, the reason that it's so successful is because it works. Okay? You can force somebody to join your church. You could, if you want a quick fix, make them. If you want to, and that was it. The church just sees a quick fix. They see this power that rose up and rules the world. And as it begins to deteriorate and everything, the church sees this opportunity. Again, Constantine put his hand out and joined with the church and comes up with this brand new power. If you're forced to worship the antithesis of loving, being loved, and to love, the church has the power of all the Roman Empire. And what are we told about it? It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Time, 2 times, and half a time. If we would have stayed with Daniel, this was the prophecy that was predicted back in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. It amounts to 1,260 years this will go on. We know that. Meanwhile, the true church is hidden in the wilderness. God protects the true church. But the dragon attacks, and when the dragon attacks, he attacks with all the ingenuity of the beast. He's put this false church forward, and on the surface, it looks good. It looks holy. It looks successful. It has all the money. It has all the people. It has all the power. It looks successful. If you were to look at both churches, you look at that one and say, well, that one looks like the right one, because it is right. But according to whose standards? According to the world's standards. That's how the world measures success. Power, wealth, majority. So the dragon attacks with this. And we're told it's with persecution. It's a flood. Water comes from the dragon's mouth. And it's complete religious intolerance. The beast has no tolerance for anybody else who believes any different. And they go on a rampage. They make war with the saints. Complete religious intolerance. It's represented by the church that you get to that is in the era of the early 500s to about the mid 1500s, 1560 or so. It is Thyatira. And he describes it in prophecy to Thyatira. He says, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman who? You tolerate Jezebel. Okay, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication, to eat food sacrificed to idols. What does Jezebel represent? If you think about it, Jezebel was the queen of Israel, married to one of Israel's worst kings, probably the second worst king in all of Israel. She was married to Ahab. She's the daughter of the king of King Ethbal of Sidon, Tyre and Sidon, one of the most pagan of pagan places that you can think of. And she marries Ahab. She's the model of something. What she's the model of is state authority. See, she's the queen of Israel, which means she's head of the Israeli government. But on her own, she bankrolled the prophets of Baal. Baal worship was completely, absolutely sponsored and enforced by her and her alone, and her crooked husband. It's an empire model. It's one of the first times that Israel comes together and makes it a law to not worship God. Okay? Makes it a law. Elijah was actually going against law. By the way, it didn't turn out too well for him either. He wiped out the prophets of Baal. She was not happy about that. But empire, in my opinion, becomes the most effective substitute, if you will, that the church looks for to substitute love. Because when the church has been persecuted for so long and in the wilderness, you know what? Not being persecuted anymore looks good. Changing to the side of not being persecuted, it looks real good. Empire is in some way or form, through the rest of history, from Thyatira on, empire is the one thing that the church seeks to substitute love for in its mission to the planet. And we know, we talk about that era and that time, the medieval church, and we look at a particular very large church denomination. Yes, it was papal and it was Catholic, but did the Reformation really do anything to truly reform that part? The very next church I'm sorry, I don't have it up there. Shoot. The very next church is Sardis, and he says to the angel of Sardis, "These are the words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and 7 stars. I know your works. You have a name of being alive, but you are dead." Sardis goes from about 1570 all the way up to 1798. That is the Reformation church. That's what Jesus says about the Reformation church. As Protestants, we look back at the history, we look back at the first beast, and we say, well, oh, that wasn't us. Guess what? The beast is still in charge by the time the Reformation comes. The Reformation is around 1400 or so. I mean, in the late 1500s. It comes at the tail end of Thyatira. And it doesn't revive the church at all. As a matter of fact, it kills the church, according to prophecy. You have a reputation of being alive, right? You have a reputation of being alive, a name of being alive. But indeed, Jesus says, you're dead. See, because by 1600, the Reformation, which began about 83 years earlier, hadn't changed the situation at all, this empire situation. By 1600, all the religious space in Europe was completely used up. The Roman Catholic Church was struggling with the Protestant dissidents. The Protestant dissidents were struggling with themselves. And what were they doing? They were all looking for their own piece of empire. There is a medieval mentality. Now it's become a mentality. It's the way people think back then. I'm sorry, but it's the way that we think now. But this medieval mentality that faith was associated with nation. One nation, one faith. Belief that ecclesiastical uniformity is essential to political health and peace. Protestantism doesn't destroy this mentality. Protestantism participates in it. Luther looked to establish a right to exist outside of the Roman Catholic Church. Every Protestant church that formed had to go to a government and look for a legal way to exist outside of the Catholic Church at the time. The Augsburg Confession was him going to the government of Austria saying, would you no longer make it a law that people have to be Roman Catholic? And they said, okay. We'll make it a law that you have to be Lutheran. So that's why the Reformation has reformers in different geographical areas. Calvin was in northern Switzerland. Zwingli was in southern Switzerland. Luther is in all of the all of the Rhineland, okay, all of those countries, because they found governments that would partner with them. Protestantism did not seek to abolish church and state non-separation. They furthered it. So each country chose their own faith, whether you're Protestant or whether you're Roman Catholic. But they're all trying to operate as empire. They saw it as a way to be able to get their mission done. They no longer had to be persecuted by government. Now the government can help. But the rights of the individual doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. The earth has to come to help the woman, because the woman is nearly being drowned. Nearly being drowned by this whole mentality. It opens up its mouth. It swallows the river the dragon had poured from his mouth. The earth opens up. It gives the woman some space. Endless space, if you will. And by 1798, the New World is a space that gives you space for religious experimentation. We're supposed to have freedom here. In the old world, you'd be persecuted until destroyed. In the New World, you're driven out of one colony, but you might be able to start another. Denominations become possible. By the way, without this space, we never ever would have heard of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Seventh-day Adventist Church is uniquely a North American-bred religion because it required it. Our doctrine, which we consider peculiar, would never have been tolerated in old Europe, in the old country. We have a lot of roots, if you will, in the Anabaptists. If you look for most of our reformers, from our reformers, we get our biggest contributions from Luther, from Wesley, and the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were persecuted by the Protestants and the Catholics because of the stands that they would take. Our church never would have been possible in the old country. We had to have North America in order for it to happen. Space is crucial. It's crucial. So after 1798, we get to the church. We get to, by the way, one of the churches that receives absolutely no rebuke. So after 1,260 years of the beast in charge, and all of the churches from Sardis all the way on, not Sardis, but from Smyrna. Smyrna is the last church to receive no rebuke. The martyred church, the church that more Christian blood was shed at any other time. It's the very next church after Ephesus. And nearly nothing good to say about any of these churches that have given in to empire, except to always mention there are a few of you. There are a few of you. By the time Philadelphia comes, something has happened. The angel of the church in Philadelphia, these are the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open. I know your works. I've set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you've kept my word and have not denied my name. Listen to what the prophet says about the North American church when it starts. 1798. And the reason I believe is one line in this prophecy, just one line. You have what? But little power. See, we were in America, okay? The church was in America. Things were happening, but it wasn't happening because of the brand new American government. The church was not seeking for government sponsorship, if you will. The Second Great Awakening happens not because of politics. It happens, I believe, because of the Holy Spirit. Mid-1790 all the way to 1840. It's the most powerful religious movement in American history. It has a double-edged sword, though, because the Second Great Awakening is what makes America believe they are a Christian nation. We'll talk about that in a bit. By the way, the last great preacher of the Second Great Awakening would be William Miller. He's the very last one. It's a wave of social reform, a right to all injustice and every problem. Abolition of slavery. They may have approached the government about abolishing slavery, but they weren't looking for the government for the power in their movement, is what I'm saying. They wanted to abolish war, poverty, health reform, temperance unions, labor unions, equality of the sexes. All of the modern Bible and missionary societies are founded during this time. Church attendance and membership goes from what they think is about 12% to about 45% in this time. Also, they could achieve some sort of social, personal perfection through reform. And the aim was to bring about the millennium, and at the end, to bring about the coming of Jesus. That was the whole reason that this entire movement was together. By the way, most all American Protestantism at this time is what we call post-millennial. In other words, that the second coming comes after the millennium. William Miller is the very first Reformed preacher, his very first awakening preacher that begins to preach that no, it happens before. Pre-millennialism. So American Protestantism, though, like I said, it's a two-edged sword. As they gain popularity, they see a way in order to be able to create this reform, and then they begin to, quote unquote, make America Christian. They begin to attack this very principle that Philadelphia was founded on, that the Second Great Awakening was founded on. You have but little what? Little power. They don't seek power. They don't seek national power. It's kind of a warning, because there's a warning, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave that side, but there's kind of a warning. We'll make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not but lying. I'll make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Jesus says, you've put the love back in my church. That's why I have nothing bad to say about you. And that false church, that fake church, that double-edged sword that is about to give in and begin to seek power, even here in North America, they'll come and bow at your feet, he says. So that church is growing right beside it. And of course, by the time we get to Revelation 13, it gives in completely, doesn't it? And a second beast rises up out of the land. See, all along, even the land rising up to give them room, the roots are here. The roots are there in North America that this can become a beast. It's telling you that this beast is coming. It won't look exactly like the first one, but it will use the same power. The second beast comes to create an image of the beast. It doesn't have to look like the first one. It doesn't have to have anything to do with the papacy. But force, deception, coercion. By the time the second beast rises, he knows how to do it, and he knows how to do it very, very well. In fact, he makes it more subtle. It isn't inquisitions and crusades, but it's a war of rhetoric. It's a war of words. It's a war of legislation. All of those things. All designed to take away religious what? Religious freedom. And since long before 9/11, we've heard the cry, haven't we? Getting back to something, right? Getting back to the Christian foundation that we are. We are a what? We are a Christian nation. Let's get back the Christian foundation. So at least 2020, to a lot of people, a new word was introduced to describe this movement, to describe this power. They call it Christian nationalism. To where the point is that the Christian has a hard time determining where the Christian stops and where the nation ends. In other words, it is still being brought together, maybe even more effectively than it was back in Thyatira. And that's what got me. What got me, actually, the pictures of the protests. I don't think there's anybody here who was not disturbed at what they saw on Thursday, right? Is there anybody here that was not disturbed by the protests? I call it insurrection. The insurrection of our own capital. Was anybody here not disturbed? No matter what side of the political spectrum you fall on, it was profoundly disturbing. But I'll tell you, if there is only one good thing that come out about this, is that the pictures, at least, woke up a particular group of people. And all of a sudden on Friday, I'm seeing more and more evangelical writers trying to get at the root of what this Christian nationalism is, because what disturbed them the most was that there was as many signs saying Jesus 2020, people carrying crosses with flags coming from them, right next to whatever other political statement they were making. In other words, their Christianity was what? Endorsing this. They see this as an act of God. Jamar Tisby wrote, he says, if you look at the pictures of the protests, you'll notice all the trappings of a so-called Christian religion. From signs that said Jesus 2020, right along the others that said Trump 2020, or a literal wooden cross being carried by members of the mob. The fusion of Christian symbolism with a perverted form of patriotism, that's what was on full display. And it woke up a lot of evangelicals around the country. So if you don't know or have not heard the term Christian nationalism, it's identified by a book that was written just a few years ago by a couple of sociologists. And they say this, they say the Christian in Christian nationalism is more about identity than religion. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. Now we can come to disagree about any one of those terms and by what degree. But what we can't disagree on is they feel that it's their Christian makeup that allows them to do this. In other words, they don't know where their nationalism stops and where their Christianity ends, because there should be an end. Thyatira told us there should be a point at time where nation needs to give way to us as Christians, and where our Christianity has to let go of some sort of national identity. Researchers that are researching Christian nationalism say this: Americans who embrace Christian nationalism strongly agree with statements like this. I'm not going to ask you if you agree or not with these statements, but just let them mill around in your head a little bit. They strongly agree. In other words, you could see the research that they're doing, okay? They make a statement and then it says, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, right? It's got that, or strongly agree. To go from strongly agree, all of these people strongly agree, okay? The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. The federal government should advocate Christian values. So when it comes to this, when it comes to what we know about being Adventists, all of us, which side of this should we fall on? What was supposed to be in our DNA when it came to being national or Christian or both? William Cork, an Adventist Army chaplain, retired, got me thinking down this line, because he said, there's something we need to think about, he says. I want the church to begin to think about this. All right. Because he's not saying that the entire church participated in this. He's talking about the various degrees in which Adventism has either exhibited a certain tendency towards Christian nationalism or not. He said, let's think about this. And he found this picture. It's a very interesting picture. This is from 1857. Okay, so these are our founders, a good, 1857, 1863, a good 5 years before we become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. These are the Sabbatarian Adventists. And look at the way they look at the United States in 1857. They noticed that the beast had two horns. In other words, there are two focuses of its power, if you will. And look down here at what the two horns are. Creeds and slavery. As a matter of fact, they have chains going from creeds to slavery. They're combating, if you will, Christian nationalism at its core, and they're doing it by attacking the one thing that they believe is anti-Christian about this entire beast. Because what is it that Adventists are supposed to believe about creeds? Do we believe in a creed or not? No, see, that goes back to our Anabaptist roots. Anabaptists were non-creedal. Because they said, if you put a creed on paper, it's what we've been talking about in permitting. You take a creed as to who we are, you put it on paper, you put it in stone, and that's it. It's written in stone. You leave no room for the Holy Spirit in your life anymore as a believer. So our founders saw creeds as being enslaved then to nationalism. Any of those statements that we just read. He wrote this. He says, it's time for Seventh-day Adventists to reflect on who we are. We have roots in radical reforms of the 19th century. Our founders were members of non-resistance and abolitionist societies. They refused to bear arms. They helped slaves escape. They preached civil disobedience. They saw the book of Revelation warning about right-wing religion that sought to embrace political power, that wanted to force Christian morality by law and declare the U.S. a Christian nation. They fought for the religious liberty of all. Today we're a global church, a movement of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. If there's any church on the planet that should reject the allure of nationalism, it's us. Because our church, spans many, many, many nations. We need to be clear on our standing as a church committed to peace and non-resistance. We need to still be a voice for social justice. We need to still be a voice for the separation of church and state. We need to hear the cries of victims of racism, the hands of the church. We need to return to being a prophetic voice, warning of the dangers of religion entwined with politics. And I agree. See, the Reformation showed us what can happen when you get back to Jesus. The Reformers got back to Jesus. How? Luther said, by what? Sola Scriptura, by the Word alone. A brand new diving into the Word. A brand new getting into the Word. But the dynamic changed. They got bogged down in their own dogma, and they gave in to the religious nationalism that was calling them. Concern for correct doctrine prevailed over relationship with God. New traditions, new creeds, they fought with each other. Intolerance begins to creep back in. Did you know that Protestants held their own Inquisition? Calvin had scholars like Michael Servetus executed in 1553. Luther raged against the Catholics and the Jews, vowing to exterminate them both. Zwingli martyred the Anabaptists. Both Protestant and Catholic churches established and reestablished themselves as powerful institutions. And we forget the sources of truth that the Protestants fell into the same mistakes and protested against in the Middle Ages, and it can happen to every church since. And the only answer again is Jesus. His love. His way. So just some things to remember, because I don't know what's going to happen. Back in 2019, and even somewhat back in 2001 after 9/11, I still had an idea or had my handle on maybe what was going to happen. But now, I have no idea. I have no idea. So just something to think about here. We have room. We've been given room. Okay? And I'm sorry when the politics happened to creep through. I couldn't tell this story without at least mentioning politics. But let me say this. There's room for us to have our politics. Okay? There's room for us to have our politics. What we don't have room for is the nationalism that political radicalism can bring. There is no room for nationalism in the Adventist church. So I think we need to be called out when our politics get that way. Both sides, by the way. Both sides. And just one other thing to remember. There are some things that we might have to get used to. There are things that we may need to let go of being in the end time, and things that we might have to get used to. One is, we're going to have to get used to appearing like we're losing. Because love in a world that operates the other way, that operates on force, fear, coercion, numbers, power, wealth, love always looks like it's losing. Doesn't it? Always. The martyrs look like saps. Right? A lot of people look at the martyrs and say, what did you die for? You changed what? Nothing. So we need to get used to losing. Okay? We need to get used to not doing things by the majority, because, by the way, majority rules is the only thing that works for the beast. And I guess that's my vision for God. That's my vision for the church as of right now. We need to get used to being in the minority, a persecuted, maligned, if you will, minority, and to remember that Jesus is with us. At least we can be together. And I think that's what's so disconcerting about this whole thing, is that the virus has separated us physically. But we still have other ways. We have ways to remain together. So if we could get used to those things, and then maybe, just maybe, I'll quit thinking that I know what's going on. And that you wake up every day saying, you know what, Lord, I have no idea what's going on today. Everything that used to anchor me, everything that used to be my foundation has been taken away. And maybe Jesus is saying to us, yep, but I'm still here. So maybe, just maybe, you can anchor into me. So these were my thoughts for us as the weeks come. Again, you guys that are here that helped with this, I really, really appreciate it. Love not being here by myself. And for everybody at home, thank you for joining us.